or specialty, if you will, or that's been developed over the last, call it 10 years, has really been around those harder to solve data challenges in the supply chain, where the majority of the emissions typically reside. So if you think about your supply chain, who are you buying your products from to come together for your product? If I'm a tech company, you develop a piece of tech hardware, but that relies on a large value chain and a number of contract manufacturers to bring that product together. And then there's energy consumed in that product over its lifetime. And so those are hard challenges, but very strategic challenges for the business, to understand the data, how it impacts you, how you set up for success, how you align your business with a low carbon economy going forward. And so our tools and our software helps organizations go from many times average or spend-based analyses to primary data from those suppliers, from your customers, from the actual use of those products.
Welcome back, Power People. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Ty Colman, co-founder and chief revenue officer of Optera. Optera is the software company dedicated to scaling carbon management to empower corporations to transition to zero emissions. Built after years of consulting for many of the world's largest corporate sustainability programs, their software has been adopted by leading enterprises like Cisco, HPE, Lowe's, NVIDIA, TJX, and Williams-Sonoma. On today's episode, we'll talk with Ty about GHG protocol as the backbone of reporting, the challenges with collecting and reporting Scope 3 emissions, how enterprises are using this data to drive their own decarbonization action and action within their supply chains, and the evolving regulatory landscape. With that, Ty, excited to chat with you.
Ty, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. You too. Good to connect with you guys again.
We always like to get to know our guests and would love to hear, what are you passionate about?
Passionate about a lot of things. I think most relevant to maybe our discussion here, I really am passionate about efficiency. So even from the early days of going through school, really driven by this idea that we can use resources better. So how much you get in versus how much you get out, and do that in a way that optimizes for our consumption. So really driving around efficiency, and the connection to sustainability was there from the start for me. And so that's what I get geeked up about.
Love that. And you're an outdoors person. On the outdoor front, what do you enjoy the most?
I am indeed. Well, we're in a season transition right now, so I'm still on the mountain bike a little bit, but skis are tuned, had the first day out, so starting to get ramped up there as well. So we're here in Colorado. We're going to have a little bit of a split for the next maybe couple weeks until the mountain bike will go away. The snow bike may come out, but I'll be on the skis a little bit more frequently through the rest of the winter.
Love it. I'm a bit jealous that you have the slopes so close there. Well, Ty, take us back. Introduce yourself. How did you get here? Where'd you grow up? Where did this passion for efficiency and sustainability come from?
Yeah. Grew up here largely in Colorado, moved out here when I was reasonably young. And that's where my connection both to the outdoors and some of the other passions for sustainability and our natural places really came from, my family, so forth. School was largely focused on engineering and science. That's what I went into college as well. And that's where the connection for me really materialized for energy, sustainability, consulting, driving organizations to a more profitable, more sustainable future. And so I had a college professor that was doing consulting all over the world, and I just really fell in love with the idea of being able to wear multiple hats in the same day and support these organizations and to be at the leading edge of a lot of the advancements of technology really across the board. So studied engineering and technology there, then left school, immediately got into some green building space, got into consulting around that, and that then had a tangent into corporate emissions accounting. Met my partner, my business partner at that time at a former consulting organization. He and I saw the need for this to really grow across sectors and certainly geographies. And we spun off and started an organization at the time called Point 380. This was in 2006. I was coming out of school in 2003, 2004. So really right after the GHG protocol was introduced in 2001, Scope 1 and 2 standard. Still didn't have anything on market-based and still don't have anything on Scope 3 yet, but we were introducing that to organizations and starting to incorporate that with some of the largest organizations. Built our business around that through the 2010s, and then really took that into software capacity. Saw the need to do this repeatedly, consistently across organizations and geographies across the world. And so really kind of built from there. And so my background took me into leading the implementation side. So I'm Chief Revenue Officer of now what is Optera. So we changed the name and took it into a software capacity. But I lead, as the Chief Revenue Officer, lead the marketing, lead the implementation side, and lead the sales function within that organization. We sell across the globe to large organizations managing emissions and carbon inventories.
Super interesting. Ty, take us back to the early days of emissions reporting and accounting. What was driving businesses to do that? And access to data had to have been a bit of a challenge. Tell us about your experience in those early days.
Yeah, it was a small set of companies, some of the largest companies in the world, but a small set that were starting to develop this information, develop an understanding and a practice area in it. I think I can talk about this because they've talked about it as well. But one of my very first clients was Coca-Cola, and we were on the phone. This was back in, must have been 2004 or 5. We were on the phone with their general counsel as they were assessing even then whether or not climate was a risk that they wanted to disclose on their 10Ks. And so developing that data to inform those opinions by, folks very high up in that organization. Now it's taken decades really from there, obviously, to get to the point where this is a commonly considered risk and can be evaluated and all that kind of stuff. But early days, it was about operational emissions, right? Scope 1 and Scope 2, data from utility providers, so forth, bringing that together. And used in a lot of different ways, right? Used for disclosure, used for efficiency, which is really where it got me into this. How do we take this data and then look at ways to change technologies, change practices within the operations research, if you're familiar with that practice, to really drive organizational excellence, save those costs, and then the cherry on top. In those days, with the cherry on top was the emissions benefit. It wasn't the first thing that they were looking for, but came along with that, of course.
Nice. Ty, a lot of people thinking about how to get into the industry wonder what the best entry point is. And many of us come from that consulting background. I think it's a really great way to get exposure to a lot of really good skills. What did consulting teach you in the early days? And then what was the catalyst or the transition to say, we need to shift from consulting only to software enabled?
I'm going to actually ask it or answer a slightly different question there as well. I'll add to it. But the thing that I think is interesting about where our industry has gone is we're now starting to see academic institutions teach, train, and provide certifications or even degrees around this. I think all three of us would probably say that when we started this, there was very little or none of that. When I came out, it was engineering. It was, in any discipline in engineering or finance or economics, and you had those analytical skills or accounting even, you had those skills and you had to adapt those to this new way of doing accounting, emissions accounting, right? Now, thrilled to see organizations, academic institutions starting to provide more of this training in school so that we're seeing talent come out ready to go, really guns blazing. So flipping back to your question, for me, I didn't know what this looked like. I knew that I wanted exposure to a lot of different problems, knew I wanted to bridge the gap between hard engineering problems and technical people and those in management, if you will, that have some of the decision-making capabilities to influence or implement these types of practices. So felt I could be a decent bridge in that. And so that's why I got into that space. The environmental passion was kind of connected there. And I just really felt fortunate that the people I worked with, the mentors I had, really supported the cultivation of that. Like, bring these two things together, go for it. If you can create a business in it, like, go to do it. And I was like, oh, this is incredible. Let's keep doing this. As we grew the consulting business, it became pretty clear that our drive for impact, really around mitigating, stopping climate change globally, was going to be very, very limited if it was a consulting only organization. There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so many people we can bring together into that group. Even the biggest consulting organizations are limited in that capacity. And so we were looking again at the things we were doing consistently and repeatably that could be scaled or democratized, if you will, to corporations across the globe. We also had the hypothesis, supported by data certainly, that corporations were both the problem and the solution for our environmental impacts, our climate change impacts. And so we've really focused on that sector and providing them the tools. And that's why we built, from our consulting practice, purpose-built tools for them to collect the data, to manage the data, to set these forecasts, and to drive these emissions reductions and targets over the long term. So that's how, I guess, that thread or that trajectory took us to the software space. And then we've doubled and tripled down on the types of tools and things that we're developing for the corporate sector there.
As you know, that description of what you just laid out there resonates with us extremely closely in our journey. Well, tell us about Optera. You're now a software company, venture-backed software company, and a massively growing team, huge customer base of blue chip clients. Tell us about what it is specifically you guys do and how you support customers to go on this journey.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So we enable corporations to stop climate change. That's our mission as our organization. And so, like I just said, major corporations are the largest emitter of carbon emissions. And our team designs and delivers sustainability management solutions, largely in our software, to help these companies reduce their climate impacts in their operations, direct operations, their supply chain, and their products. And our focus, or I guess our specialty, if you will, or that's been developed over the last, call it 10 years, has really been around those harder to solve data challenges in the supply chain, where the majority of the emissions typically reside. So if you think about your supply chain, who are you buying your products from to come together for your product? If I'm a tech company, you develop a piece of tech hardware, but that relies on a large value chain and a number of contract manufacturers to bring that product together. And then there's energy consumed in that product over its lifetime. And so those are hard challenges, but very strategic challenges for the business, to understand the data, how it impacts you, how you set up for success, how you align your business with a low carbon economy going forward. And so our tools and our software helps organizations go from many times average or spend-based analyses to primary data from those suppliers, from your customers, from the actual use of those products. And that's been the big, I guess, leap, if you will, that we took, rather than trying to develop a better LCA product or something like that, which uses average data. We really wanted to get down to supplier-specific information. And so about a decade of work in that with some of these leading companies, as you mentioned, has helped us develop and amass a very large data set that we can then redeploy for other customers where the data is public, of course, and appropriate to share, that allows them to impact and account for their supply chain right off the bat. Oftentimes we're seeing 80% coverage of their supplier data day one. Same on their customer side. What the customers are using it? How are they being able to incorporate that data into those analyses? And the last thing I'll say is we're very focused on GHG protocol aligned accounting. So we really want to support inventories that are reportable regulatory reportable, whether that's going to be European or US regulations. So the GHG protocol is the backbone of that, has been the backbone of what we do here. And so all of the things I discussed are really kind of framed around that.
Ty, I think, what you're obviously talking about is scope 3 emissions. Some people won't have heard that term. Do you want to give a quick intro into like the definition of the scope 3 emission, why it scares a lot of people, and then like why is it such a hard challenge for people to overcome in terms of like, do they have the data and it's about coordinating the data, or is it actually they don't even know where to start and how to get the data and what to even do with it to get the insights they need?
Great question. And very quick step back. Scope 1 and 2 emissions, there's 3 scopes. Scope 1 and 2 is going to be your operational emissions. The data for that is, 9 times out of 10 collected from utility bills. You may have some on-site metering or something like that, but it's going to be how many kilowatt hours you consume from the electricity or how many MMBTUs of natural gas or your vehicle fleet. Somebody in your organization owns that. Somebody's managing it really closely because that is, an operational expenses or capital expenses if it's vehicles, those kind of things. Scope 3 is effectively everything else. It's your value chain. It's all of your upstream purchase goods and services like your contract manufacturers. It's your buildings. It's your business travel, your employee commuting, and then the use of your product in the market. And you as an organization have to take responsibility for that. And the greenhouse gas protocol gives us a framework to do that. How do we allocate those emissions to us versus our customers versus, other folks that may be in that value chain? And what typically happens is companies have, like you said, Gareth, some trepidation about going into this because where's the data? How do we get it? How do we think about primary data versus secondary data? How many there's 15 categories. How do we do all the categories? Are they relevant to us? Are they not relevant to us? And so a lot of times our job as an organization and as a consultant is to help everybody just take a deep breath, recognize in many cases right off the bat that there's many categories that aren't relevant. Things like franchises or investments may not be relevant to an organization because that's not what they do. They don't make, investments, VC investments. They don't have franchises. But we can pare it down, usually in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 categories that are relevant. And then of those, which ones are material? Usually it's in the neighborhood of 2, possibly 3 categories. First one's going to be your supply chain, which is your category 1, your purchase goods and services. Second one is going to be the transportation and distribution of those products. How does it get around to all the different consumers and so forth? And then the last one is going to be the use of the product. And when you're talking about an electrical product or a motor or whatever that may be, there's long-term use or a car, all of those. So when we think about this, we try and bucket it like that. Relevancy and the materiality. And then the material categories are the ones we want to really drill into and work on getting the best, most accurate data possible. That's the places where you have the most actionability and are the biggest strategic advantages or levers within your organization. That data exists. I know folks have hard time sort of getting their head around it, but your procurement team, your finance team, they know exactly who your suppliers are, how much you spent with them, what you bought from them. Comes in your general ledger, right? We can get this information, and that's the starting point. So as long as you engage with the right person in your business, the data, by and large, is more easily at hand than not.
Fascinating. No, fascinating. And I'd say, so let's kind of take it a step further. Let's assume we now have the data, and I think it's awesome. Maybe you can touch a little bit on how you said from the get-go, oftentimes you can have 80% of it ready to go. And so maybe you can touch on how you guys get there. But then I'd like to understand, okay, let's now say that we've got our baseline or we know where we're at. We've used it to now set some goals. What do people do with this data?
Yeah, great. So the first, the data accessibility and how we start incorporating it into analysis, there's a number of different strategies or methods to do that. I'll just describe one of the easiest ones. You buy computers, your organization buys computers from Dell, right? Let's just say. You go out, you buy a Dell computer, and in effect, you are taking a slice of their emissions and associating it with you. If you bought all of Dell computers, you would be responsible for all of Dell's emissions. but I doubt you're quite there. Neither are we, right? So you are responsible for, let's say, 1% of Dell's revenue. So you take 1% of Dell's emissions that are publicly disclosed. Their scope 1, their scope 2, their upstream scope 3. Take a slice of that, put it into your business as part of your purchased goods and services. Let's say you buy 50 other different products. Each one of those from each of those organizations gets a small slice, and you basically create this layer cake of all of these different suppliers for your purchased goods and services emissions category 1. From there, then you start seeing where your biggest hitters are, right? Your hotspots. Oh, wow. Okay, we spend a lot with Dell, and there's a lot of emissions associated with that. How do we think about reducing that going forward? Well, Dell's got a very advanced program. They're reducing rapidly. Let's say they're reducing 10% per year. I don't know if there's anything that you or I are going to do with Dell that's going to further reduce that. So we're going to say, great, they may be high right now, but as we forecast this out, they're going to be a pretty low impact supplier over the next 10 years. But look at this, supplier 3 or 4 is moderate impact now, but they aren't doing anything in their sustainability program. They're barely reporting data. They're very high fossil fuel consumption and maybe not aligned with emissions targets in the long term. That would be the place where we might spend a bit more time engaging with that supplier, understanding, supporting their capacity building for why and how these types of programs may be advantageous to them. If you think about a large organization like Dell, this is exactly what they're doing in their supply chain. They're going through, figuring out the hotspots, figuring out who and how to engage. And there's a surprising amount of data that's provided by these organizations to produce these metrics and read the tea leaves, if you will, on who is a priority supplier now, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, based upon what and how they're consuming. And then their team will put together programs to make this happen and reward suppliers and penalize or maybe not provide as many incentives to maybe some of the ones that are lagging or slow to mature as they would need. Some organizations are even putting together requirements for their suppliers. If you want to do business with us, these things must be in place, like a target, like emissions disclosures, and so forth. And so that's what our software helps to capture, manage, group, and then engage those suppliers over the long term to make this happen. In addition to all the scope 1 and 2 stuff as well. But as we specifically focus on supply chain, that's one of the modules that we dive really deep in.
Ty, I'd love to learn a bit more about like the carrots and sticks being applied by companies today to achieve these objectives. Like, what are the best examples that you've seen of either contract heavy, penalty based, or the reward side?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly companies that will not do business with you if you do not have some of these things in place. I see this a little bit in the pharmaceutical industry, starting to have more introduction in the tech space or tech hardware space, getting that brought in there. What we typically see right now is a preferred vendor status. So if you meet all of these things, you get a preferred status, maybe favorable terms on your payment schedule or those kind of things. So that's where it kind of comes together. Scorecarding happens a lot, really across industries. So quarterly business reviews, particularly with your largest key suppliers, is coming together with this data. And so you may have a supplier rep from a brand engage with their counterpart at that supplier and review where they are on all these different metrics on a quarterly basis. And it's truly coming together in that fast of a time. And they're developing 2-year roadmaps together, aligning commitments, getting sign-offs by business leaders that these things are going to be in place, and then expecting those suppliers to drive and make those things happen. And again, potentially jeopardizing business if that's not going to be the case.
And just building on that, and so for me as the company driving my suppliers to do this, and for me to report it and track it and document it, like, what is the benefit for me as an organization? Like, what is my return on investment or motivation?
For your management of that data?
Well, just for me as a company, why would I want to drive this scope 3 enablement? Like, what are the benefits to me as an organization?
Yeah, totally. Well, it helps you align with regulatory disclosures as well. Again, you're going to have this in the EU or US, so forth. But it really gives you visibility. And if we think about supply chain specifically, into those strategic suppliers. I mean, think about the issues we had going through COVID just on access to materials, right? That's a little bit different, but adjacent to what we're talking about here for emissions management and program management of these suppliers. And without that information, you have no idea how at risk your cost could be for these different products that you may be buying, disruptions from climate impacts, heat, water, flooding, you name it, right? And so the type of information we're talking about developing really informs risk and supplier risk throughout your supply chain. It just in one facet outside of just the reporting side. And so we're really seeing some companies lean into this in ways that help them look at second and third suppliers, should one be more at risk than others, and diversify that supply chain for a changing economy.
Yeah, super important. And so you touched on some of the kind of the internal drivers. Let's shift a little bit to the regulatory landscape and understanding some of the external drivers on companies doing this. You mentioned the GHG protocol as being a bit of the framework and the backbone for the calculations that you're running. What's the current state of affairs? And maybe we break it out across the EU and the US and other geographies around the world. What's the current state of affairs, and what's your outlook over the next 2, 5, 10 years?
Sure. I think that investors have been the tip of the spear here, and largely the reason that companies, that CDP, for example, was created in the first place. A group of investors got together. We need this information to inform our long-term investment strategies. I still think investors wield a lot of power in this market, even if it's not a regulatory driven, but they wield the power on what should be disclosed and how it should be disclosed. And that's regardless of where you are, US companies, European companies, Asian companies, and so forth. Regulatory frameworks have come into existence in the last couple of years, largely European leading the way. And I won't throw out a million different acronyms because they have really done it to us. There's dozens of them, really. But broad brush, European regulations are forcing companies that sell goods in Europe or reside in Europe to disclose scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, scope impacts to their value chain, climate-related financial risk to their businesses, like I mentioned, even all the way back to the Coca-Cola days, those kind of things. So all of that is being disclosed starting in 2026. Some of these actually have implications earlier than that, but we won't go into that. So that's happening. And so if you're a business, even residing in the US, large presence organizations that sell into the EU, this affects you too. The US as an entity has been slower to respond. The SEC about a year and a half ago signaled that they were going to require this in financial disclosures, require the reporting of emissions and climate-related financial risks. Then they paused on that because California came out and said, we're going to require this for all entities that do business in California over a certain threshold. The SEC reevaluated. And now with the result of the recent election, we anticipate that the SEC will not pursue mandatory climate-related disclosures in the near future. We do anticipate California is going to proceed. They signaled that even in October before the election with Senate Bill 219 that they were going to proceed with their other Senate bills. And so we are anticipating that 2026 is going to be the first disclosure for those organizations that are impacted by that one as well, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 companies. If you add that to the European, you're looking anywhere between 40, 50, 60,000 companies globally that are subject to these regulations. A lot of names that we know, big, huge monster companies, but there's still a surprising number of billion-dollar plus companies that are subject to these in one way or another. Even if it's through their customers, they're going to have to report against this. The last thing I'll maybe say about this, greenhouse gas protocol is the fundamentals for all of this. So thankfully, we have coalesced around a reporting framework that is long time in the market, what majority of the companies use, 98% or more. And so we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're a lot of times just carrying forward work that has been done, tried and true by these organizations.
And Ty, if I've got to start reporting this in 2026, What's the lead time for me turning this on? Like, this obviously isn't an overnight press a button and you're good to go. Like, what is the typical lead time you're seeing for companies to get in a really good spot to be able to confidently report?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a 2026 report on 2025 data. So for my money, I want this system in place before 2025 starts, right? Because you want to be collecting this and understanding it and vetting it and going through all of the implementation, software implementation and understanding organizational alignment before you get to the end of that year. Otherwise, it's going to be an absolute mess, which is one of the reasons in the lead up here over the last couple of quarters, we've seen an increasing amount of interest, as you might imagine, into the software systems and tools, into the consulting approach, whatever it may be, as organizations go, I got to get all my ducks in a row to make sure that 2025 is as least bumpy as possible so that 2026 is smooth on the disclosure side.
It obviously touches many aspects of the business. What are the key roles and sort of job titles that you're seeing as your primary everyday buyers, let's say, or key stakeholders who you're typically interacting with?
Interesting you bring that up. That has been a very changing landscape for us in just the last 18 months. Prior to that, our company engaged almost solely with the sustainability director, chief sustainability officer, VP sustainability, something like that within an organization. But as this has risen in significance to these organizations, regulatory being a driver of that for sure. We have IT at the table. We have procurement at the table. We have finance at the table. We have internal auditing functions at the table, all weighing in on what is the right solution for us that helps obviously align with regulatory stuff, voluntary, and then just the management of this overall. So our typical stakeholder has risen in importance in some respects, but their singular voice and decision-making ability for what platform or not, or what solution or not, has gotten watered down a little bit and been shared across those organizations. Some cases a good thing, maybe not in other cases. In terms of the management of this data, our sustainability function is going to be oftentimes a place where it's centralized and they quarterback who needs to bring in the information from the other facets. So you might have facilities and engineering bringing together data for the operations. You're going to have human resources bringing in data for maybe like business travel or employee commuting, procurement, doing things like our supply chain, the engineering team for our product use and market. And that quarterback in the sustainability function needs to understand, obviously, how well the business works and who to talk to, when to talk to them, what their data structures look like, and then figure out a way to bring that all together in a cohesive data management structure that aligns with these regulatory frameworks. And that's, of course, where we fit in and help, decipher all of the challenges that may come with those bespoke data sets.
It's a big challenge. Good that you guys have built software to manage it. And I think within anything in life, I think the whole purpose of all this is if you don't measure it, then you can't improve. So let's maybe go back to that example that you gave of you've identified one of your suppliers that maybe isn't on track. So 2026 comes, we're reporting. The whole goal is to then see reductions in your greenhouse gas emissions across all three scopes. I think we talk a lot about on the podcast ways that companies are addressing their own operational emissions, scope 1 and scope 2. Maybe you can give some examples of how companies are driving, let's say, their upstream supply chain to decarbonize.
Yeah, it's great. And in very many of the same ways they think about their own operations, they apply those same lenses to their suppliers too. So they want to know what their suppliers' scope 1 emissions are, what their suppliers' scope 2, what their suppliers' scope 3 emissions are. And if you're an advanced brand managing your suppliers, you're breaking that down and figuring out what are our opportunities near term, medium term, and long term. And so there's a lot going on right now with suppliers around renewable energy. And so you're going to have a maybe significant scope 2 burden or impact by the suppliers. And so the brands may be actively trying to bring those suppliers into conversations, into relationships with vendors, relationship with organizations on how you can apply renewable energy into those operations. Could be on site, could be PPAs, could be even energy attribute certificates, those kind of things. But giving them and upskilling them in what those options are, so that the supplier can be able to take that on. And that may knock off a good portion of those emissions, but you're still going to have impacts in maybe your scope one, your process gases, or your fossil on-site fossil gases. And so figuring out what is the next level that's going to have to happen there. And it may not be your immediate impact, but what's going to need to be thought of in the next 5 years or more. And then further encouraging those suppliers to understand their supply chain the same way that the brand is getting to their tier one, right? So you're talking about tier two or tier three suppliers that need to be understood in the same way, and leveling up on those techniques, those tools, sharing some of the data, sharing some of the resources to make that happen.
And Ty, how much have you seen? This is something that we've seen in some of the work that we've been doing in the space of the suppliers that maybe are a bit reluctant, that don't necessarily want to go on this journey, or they're doing it a bit begrudgingly. The drivers of this initiative bringing in not just, hey, we need you to do this because you're helping meet our goals, but here's the financial impacts of you doing so. Because oftentimes there are great financial business cases to do this. You talked a little bit about the efficiencies, and part of your passion in driving all this is there are ways to reduce operational costs in doing some of these things. How do you see these large organizations that are driving down their scope 3 emissions bringing that financial component into the conversation to supplement the emissions conversation?
I think it's a great call, and technologies, operational technologies like HVAC and lighting, you see the cost curves on those have just like dropped off a cliff. I mean, it's just like, you're talking about days of payback, where, a decade ago or more ago, it was, maybe years of payback. Solar or renewables overall, I think, has done a lot of the same thing. And I'm sure you see this when you're talking with your organizations. The payback in some of these things is so attractive that companies have a hard time maybe believing it sometimes. And once you get that, and once you can show some of those case studies, they go, well, hang on a second. This is absolutely the thing we need to be doing for a whole host of reasons, including that cost and including the sustainability sort of side of it. But more often than not, that sustainability is the cherry on top to that cost aspect. The thing that really, and I sounds like you've been hearing some reluctance, I would say from us, there's single digits holdout now. Where it used to be, maybe there was a dozen or more of companies that are like, listen, we're not doing this now. We're not touching this now. Now in a very big organizational supply chain, there's, 3 or 4. And part of the reason for that is I think so many of the brands are asking, and how interwoven those supply chains are, that they're getting it from 10 different customers. And they finally have to say, okay, we got to take this seriously. Let's get on this. Everybody's asking us for this. This is going to actually sort of not just be something that we have to do from a cost perspective. It is a business driver for us, and something maybe we can get in front of. And so that's been collective action around that has been a huge, huge benefit. And groups like the Responsible Business Alliance have been responsible for that. And then others in the retail space have been responsible for driving their retail supply chain, fashion industry too. I mean, so much of that's so interwoven is really helping those suppliers to recognize that this is not a passing one-off ask, but this is going to get every time and going to be something that, really impacts the business longevity.
Yeah, that customer and contract retention and protection of that as an organization is key, isn't it? If you want to sell into these big businesses, you got to kind of play the game.
Fully.
Yeah.
Fully. And it's not just being, responding with a yes, but actually being proactive about that.
Yeah.
Hey, we are going to be a great partner to you in your decarbonization strategy. We're not going to be a liability, right? We're not dragging our feet on this when we're actually leading the charge, and you can see this. And I think more and more that's being, more heavily weighed in the procurement decisions.
Yeah. From that liability perspective, Ty, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you're seeing in the market that you think are just kind of either now outdated or almost old wives' tales that people have embedded in their heads that something can't be achieved or it's too hard, that you're kind of seeing the barriers being knocked down every day?
You mentioned it earlier, but I think data accessibility is one of those that once you start discussing with an organization, walking them through the roadmap on this continuous improvement on data and where it comes from, the more there's this like, aha, oh, it is there and we can actually make this happen. I think that there's a little bit of friction sometimes with sort of strict financial accounting folks where they say, well, if it's not perfect, we can't do it. To which we often say, financial accounting is not perfect. I know, I'm sure we're going to get some comments on that one, but it's not perfect. There are different sort of guidelines that they have to stay within, and it's the exact same way in emissions accounting as well. I hear this like, it's all Wild West. It's not Wild West. This is going through rigorous data checks. It's going through assurance in many cases. I mean, we bump into the big four assuring the data that we develop all the time. The process is the data. And so it is not a, random, let's pick numbers out of our hat, but a very standardized, repeatable, consistent, transparent process for this. And once folks really start to see that when they look under the hood and we can describe what's going on here and certainly showcase examples from the biggest organizations we've worked with, they go, okay, let's get this going.
Ty, you've been a pioneer in the space, one of the early drivers of this, and you and your team have really made it easier for companies to do this. So thank you for all that. Let's shift into the power surge, and I'll start us off with if you could be any one energy technology, what would it be and why?
Energy technology. There's one I've had affinity for I don't know, forever maybe, but it's geothermal. I think geothermal technology is so interesting. It uses our natural resources. It's renewable. It gives us both heat opportunities that we can use in process applications, but can also be repurposed or purposed for electricity as well, right? To drive steam turbines or whatever. So it's just got that multiple application. Also, geothermal is the basis for some natural hot springs, which are freaking awesome. And here in Colorado, is fun to run around and check those as well. So geothermal would be what I think I would pick out as a pretty cool technology I'd want to be.
Love that. We're both hot spring and hot tub lovers. I think you speak.
There you go. Okay.
So, we'll go for that. And Ty, you're obviously super well read and researched. Is there any kind of key areas of data or resources that you typically go to regularly for your content?
Yeah, a number of industry publications. Trellis, what used to be GreenBiz, is a place. I think they do a great job of aggregating the top headlines from organizations on what they're doing. I pick into those every single day. Ooh, what's this organization doing? What's this organization doing? Oh, that's a client of ours. What are they talking about publicly that I may not have seen? And so that's just a great way to kind of skim the landscape and understand some of the themes and trends. I follow a number of NGOs as well and what they're talking about and some of the big advocacy work they're doing. WWF, of course, comes to mind, as does RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute. I think they're just RMI now. But RMI is an exceptional organization, and they really led the charge. In fact, my co-founder back in the day was former RMI, and I just have a ton of respect for their team as well. And then, I hate to say it, but actually reading the regulations, it is mind-numbing sometimes, but really understanding what they're talking about, not just the synthesis of, what a consulting organization decides to put in a 2-paragraph blurb, but actually understanding and reading that has a lot of important information in there that we carry forward with the work and the platform we're building and how we align to those.
Someone's got to do it. And I'm sure your customers are thankful that you are. Let's close with if you were to finish this statement, whether personally or professionally, in my life, I will have been successful when.
I mean, I would love to say that, making a dent or moving the needle on uh, greenhouse gas impacts across the globe over the course of my lifetime. It's been on an upward swing since I was born, really, right? Um, I think it's a bit too much to think that my direct action, even my organization's action, as much as I think we do incredible work, is going to be the one responsible for this. So if I take it a little bit more sort of close to home, being able to coach folks, whether it's my team, whether it's our clients, in the work that is needed here to continue to advance, to continue to progress, to continue to drive towards a more sustainable future. So it's coaching around that. It's giving them the tools, the techniques, and being a mentor to those that I got to learn from as well, and be able to carry that forward. The legacy aspect, if you will.
Well, you've done that over the last 45 minutes for our listeners, and more to come. And again, thank you for your leadership and your team's leadership. And it's just been a pleasure. You're tackling an enormous challenge, and one that is much needed. So thank you, Ty, and we'll look forward to continuing to track yours and Optera's success, and we'll likely have you on again here in the not too distant future to talk about how the landscape is changing.
Fantastic. Well, Dan, Gareth, appreciate it. You guys are awesome, and I really love the work that you're doing as well, and the commonality and the overlap with what we do is just spot on, and we're all working towards the same things, and I'm encouraged to see the progress we're going to make together over the next 5 to 10 years.
Agreed. Well, thank you for the time, Ty.
Cheers.
All right, Gareth. That was an awesome session. Super informative. I really appreciate Ty and his energy and his dedication to this space over the last couple decades. What were some of the big things that jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most informative sessions we've had on the podcast. I think it was really enjoyable. Ty's a super knowledgeable guy, and he's seeing the whole build out of this market. I think the two big takeaways for me were one, that the reality is that there are regulations in place, and particularly like Europe has led the way, and California is obviously bringing in their own regulations. And I think regardless of whether the SEC pulls through and enforces this from a reporting perspective, I think many big businesses are operating in Europe or California or have a presence there. And they're going to have to do this from a regulatory reporting perspective. But regardless, I think the fact that the financial markets are driving this, and I think the fact that the biggest corporates in the world are driving this through their supply chains in order to win and retain contracts and ensure that you are able to continue to deliver your products and services to these businesses, you have to show that you're monitoring, reporting, tracking, and doing something about it is, I think, a huge tailwind. I think there's a bit of nervousness following the election that this market was going to be very challenged as a result of the new administration, but I'm not sure that'll be the case. So I think that was the biggest one. And I think in addition to that, it would be the fact that as a result of that, the whole Scope 3 reporting side of the industry touches so many facets of businesses, supply chain, risk. I really appreciated Ty referencing the supply chain risk side of it, sustainability, finance, procurement, ops. And I think we're seeing the same on the on-site energy side, aren't we? As more and more people need to be involved. And so as an industry, we need to ensure that that data, the standardization, the reporting, the workflows appeal to multi-stakeholder groups. This isn't a one-person decision-making process. And so, super interesting. What about you?
I'll touch a little bit on your first comment there around the regulatory side of things. And as you know, I spent several years in the digital identity and fraud prevention world, which was all around personally identifiable information. And there was a massive regulation that came through just before 2020, called GDPR in Europe. And California relatively quickly followed suit with its own Privacy Act. Yet we haven't seen any of that regulation follow across the entirety of the U.S., but all companies that touch any sort of personally identifiable information follow these regulations because, like you said, they operate in these locations. And so I think we're going to see the same here in the energy and emissions landscape, where companies are just going to do it because they operate there or because their investors or their customers are going to drive them. So interesting to see the parallels in the two worlds that I've lived in. For me, the big takeaway from Ty is just the scope 3 is can be so nebulous, and companies say, well, we need perfect data in order to report or in order to make decisions. And Ty's sentiment around, not letting perfect, get in the way of progress really holds true to what we're doing as well. I think we see too often people taking an extremely heavy, design and engineering approach to these commercial industrial projects, like as if they're a multi-megawatt, gas power station or a nuclear plant or something that does require those, where you have to squeeze out every minute, piece of efficiency and extra, generation and the 10 decimal places to the cent of power generation. But within these commercial industrial projects, we need to move quickly. We need to do them at scale. We don't need to go through that level of detail. Not to say that we can't look at the details. You have to, but we don't need to over-engineer them on the front end. And we need to identify where there's strong projects and go deep on those, rather than trying to over-engineer everything and be perfect across the board. Because just like in any financial projection, no different here, we're modeling out and trying to look into our crystal ball and predict what's happening 20, 25 years out. We can do that a little bit for maybe the first couple of years, but the reality is nobody knows what energy prices are going to be 15, 20 years from now. Nobody knows how, cloud cover patterns are going to change and how that might impact solar radiation. They're all models, and there's going to be flaws in the models, but we can't let that prevent us from making progress. So I appreciate the work that Ty and the Optera team are doing in trying to close some of that gap and get it to the point where people can report on it, can take action, but not feel like it has to be perfect data.
And I think we're coming to the end of chapter 1 of this industry, aren't we? Where I think up until now it's been, how do we actually consolidate the data? How do we analyze the data, and how do we turn it into some sort of reporting standard that we can do something with? I think what's super exciting for all of us is we're now moving into that second chapter of, well, we now know what our emission profiles are, and we know what we're responsible for. And actually, there's a huge financial opportunity for us to go and do something about it. And so now chapter 2 needs to be all about action and profitability, sustainability, all being interlinked, and making sure that we're really investing in the right projects at the right time in the right places. So I think Tyler and the team have set us up for success, because many customers now have the data to go and do something about it.
Amen.
All right.
Take care.
Catch you next time.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.